Welcome back to Quick Bits. This week was explosive in the Karen Reed trial, and we left at the end of the day on Friday with quite a battle of the wills between Alan Jackson and the Commonwealth's accident reconstruction expert, which is just a preview of what's going to happen in court on Monday, June 17th. And on The Emily Show, we talked a bit about Baldwin and Baby Reindeer. Let's get into it. I'm legal analyst Emily D. Baker. This is the Quick Bits, where I break down just the main points of the pop culture and entertainment cases I'm currently covering on YouTube and the Emily Show podcast. Let's get into it. Starting with the Emily Show this week, there is a Baby Reindeer lawsuit. It is one of a multitude of lawsuits currently against Netflix. This seems to be becoming more of a pattern. There are a number of Tiger King lawsuits. There's the recently resolved lawsuit over the Queen's Gambit and the Central Park Five. But this is a $170 million lawsuit from the quote unquote real life Martha. So if you want the whole deep dive into that lawsuit, it's on the Emily Show. And I did a quick update on what's going on in New Mexico versus Alec Baldwin, because Baldwin's team is objecting to the court granting use immunity for Hannah Gutierrez Reed, and that hearing will be on Friday, June 21st. I'm really interested to see what the court does there, because it's going to change a little bit of what happens in trial starting in July. And for a trial that looks like it might go to jury deliberation in July, let's talk about Karen Reed. At the end of week 7 of the Commonwealth versus Karen Reed, we are on the Commonwealth's 64th witness, and we have not yet heard from a medical examiner. We have only heard a bit of forensic data, and I have been waiting for forensic data from the victim's cell phone and from the defendant's cell phone, but we got glimpses of what's to come in the witnesses throughout week 7. So let's just get into it. Day 22 of trial, Monday, June 10th, there were motions before court resumed, and we really got a peek into the fighting behind the scenes for both sides. The frustration for the defense was that the prosecution was saying they had not disclosed all of the expert testimony. And of course, there are very firm deadlines for those disclosures. And the defense said, look, the court told us we can't prep these experts. We did not hire them. They are the experts from the federal investigation. So these are not experts retained by the defense. These are experts who made reports as part of the federal investigation into this case and the federal grand jury. And then those reports got turned over, and the defense said, we are calling these witnesses. So the court said, am I to believe you have not interviewed these witnesses? And the defense said, no, we have set up scheduling, but we have the same report the Commonwealth does. So the court has set aside an entire day for voir dire on what these experts will say, which means, like in the Murdaugh case, we will get a full day of these experts' testimony outside the presence of the jury, and then likely with the jury present. So we will hear from these experts twice, possibly twice next week, because the day of voir dire is going to be Tuesday, June 18th. But if the defense just has those reports, both of the defense attorneys are former prosecutors, I can believe that they're like, well, based on this report, we're going with it, because they also would have these experts' grand jury testimony if they testified. So it's not unlikely to me that that's exactly the case here. Then we got into the witnesses this week. Witness 55, Sergeant Buchanan, finished his testimony on Monday. The cross-examination resumed with an argument between Alan Jackson and Sergeant Buchanan about whether or not an inverted video is a true and accurate depiction of an event. Again, leaning into, but you said this was a true and accurate reflection, but it's flipped. So it seems that we're looking at the passenger side of the car when really we're looking at the driver's side of the car. And is that really accurate? We then got into the fact that in real time, that video from the Sally Port covers more than 18 minutes. But the video itself, the entirety of the video, is just over 5 minutes and 51 seconds long. And again, the sergeant said, it's my understanding that those videos are motion activated. So when they see motion in the Sally Port, then they start recording, and that's why they're choppy. The next witness I thought was very interesting, and because of everything that happened this week, this witness's testimony may get forgotten, but it's not going to be forgotten during closing arguments. Sergeant Barros from Dighton PD was called by Proctor and Buchnick when they were on their way to Karen Reed's parents' home where she was in Dighton. This sergeant rolled out to the home and stayed there while state troopers were inside interviewing Karen Reed and seizing her phone. He kept an eye on the Lexus outside, saw it get loaded up onto the tow truck and taken away. The most important thing from this officer's testimony is his statement about the condition of the Lexus, which was that he saw, quote, some damage to the right rear taillight, cracked and a small piece missing. That observation fairly well mirrors what we heard from Carrie Roberts and others. It was cracked with a small piece missing. Not what we heard from Buchnick and Proctor, that large pieces of taillight was missing and that the taillight on the exterior of the car, not on the tailgate, was essentially completely gone. And then the Commonwealth called Trooper Proctor. The beginning of the testimony of Trooper Proctor was about the investigation. Where did he go? What did he do? How did he make decisions? He got a call from Sergeant Lank, then he spoke to Sergeant Good and some of the EMS that responded to the scene, went to the McCabe's house and talked to Matt, Jen, and Brian Albert, then went to Good Samaritan to see John O'Keefe and recover and bag his clothing, then went to Karen Reed's parents' house to talk to her and then seized the phone and the vehicle, saw the broken taillight on the vehicle, then applied for search warrants, then went back to Canton PD with that vehicle, then laid the victim's clothes out on butcher paper to start to dry. So we got a whole kind of recitation of what happened January 29th. Proctor's testimony was that he did not go to 34 Fairview until February 3rd and recovered things from 34 Fairview on February 8th, 11th, and 18th. And we've seen those items marked into evidence with some of the other witnesses and then physically brought into evidence with this witness. They talked about the ring video and getting warrants for the ring video, and that the trooper noticed that there's no video from Karen Reed returning to John O'Keefe's home from 34 Fairview on January 29th, though there's a real interesting question about that in cross-examination. Lally then asks about the relationship with the Alberts, and he said those are his sister's friends, that they are acquaintances, and that he doesn't have direct relationships with the Alberts. And he talks about Julie and Brian Albert and Colin, their son. And then the Commonwealth got into Trooper Proctor's text messages. And that is where a lot of the rest of the week goes. If you have not heard these text messages, there is a segment at the end of Alan Jackson's cross-examination when he goes through everything this trooper said in quick sensation. On the quick bits, I will leave out some of the harsher language, but there is quite a lot in these text messages. And the Commonwealth went through a lot of them, but not all of the text messages that the defense brought up. So it started with his group text with his friends from high school and some he's known as far back as elementary school, who all grew up with him in Canton and now live in different places and on and on. But the first one of interest to me was from a friend, as on the night of January 29th, Trooper Proctor is telling his high school buddies about this investigation and about victim John O'Keefe, even though later in his testimony he says, I don't talk about ongoing investigations. Well, your text messages talk about ongoing investigations, and those things aren't different, but okay. The friend said, surely the owner of the house will receive some shit. And the response was, nope, he's a Boston cop too. And from the context of these text messages, I can't tell if they are saying the homeowner will receive some shit legally because there is someone on his lawn, or from the community and from other cops because there is a deceased Boston police officer on his lawn. The second gives a little context to the homeowner is a Boston cop too, but I think, again, like almost everything in this case, it's open for interpretation. We then hear additional statements as Trooper Proctor is telling his friends what happened. He said she waffled him, she hit him with her car. They arrived at the house together, got in a fight, and she hit him and left. There will be some serious charges for the girl, and called her a whack job. See you next Tuesday. And when he tried to spell that out in court, the defense objected, and the court essentially said, did you spell it or did you say it? You need to say it. And so that began days of dropping the see you next Tuesday in court. Alan Jackson said it with some vigor in the way he accents both the C and the T in that word. Lally, not so much. In response to, she's a whack job, the friend said, she hot at least? To which Trooper Proctor responded, yeah, she's a babe, weird Fall River accent, no ass. And it went on like that. He also had texts with his sisters, with other troopers who were investigating this case, some of whom are his supervisors. They texted about the medical examiner, this defendant's medical condition, called her derogatory names. So I am surprised at how thoroughly the prosecution confronted these texts, but I am also surprised that knowing all of these texts were going to come into trial, that we're still here. The thing that became clear from the text messages, if you can put the language, the insults aside, that the night of the 29th, Trooper Proctor, who was really the lead case agent on this case, had decided that Karen Reed got in a fight with John O'Keefe, hit him with her car, and left him in the snow. Before the car had been examined, before the coroner had done a report, before any of the digital evidence was in. And in his testimony, he said he based that off of the fact that he saw the victim's injuries. The victim had one shoe at the scene recovered, one shoe at the hospital, and that there were a few pieces of taillight recovered under the snow by the CERT team at and just after 5:45 p.m. on January 29th. Those things are what led this trooper, and it seems the entire investigative team, to believe by the night of the 29th that Karen Reed was at fault and this was a vehicle versus pedestrian accident. Even though Trooper Buchanan told the medical examiner earlier in the day this could have been a domestic violence related incident, that Karen Reed had said, I hit him, that maybe he could have been hit by a glass. All that aside, Proctor's texts show that he had decided by the late evening, January 29th. Getting into cross-examination on Monday, it started with text messages regarding David Yannetti, where Trooper Proctor is saying, I hate that man, I truly hate him. And then he starts asking why he hates Yannetti. And then he gets into the fact that Trooper Proctor in August 2022 is talking about searching the defendant's phone and says to his coworkers and supervisors in text, no nudes so far. He's then cross-examined pretty vigorously about whether he was searching her phone for nudes. And he said repeatedly that he stopped searching Karen Reed's phone because there were text messages between her and her lawyer, David Yannetti, on January 29th, 2022. And Trooper Proctor made sure to say that Karen Reed was texting David Yannetti on January 29th, 2022. I don't know if the jury heard it over how loudly he said, see you next Tuesday, and how frequently he derided the defendant, but we'll see. Getting into Wednesday, January 12th, the cross-examination of Trooper Proctor resumed. There was no court on Tuesday. Alan Jackson goes back through all of the texts again, including a text where Trooper Proctor says, zero chance she skates, she's fucked. And Alan Jackson did say she's fucked about 1 million times. I mean, that's a little bit of hyperbole. They then talk about conflicts of interest, that Trooper Proctor never told the DA's office he had a relationship with anybody in the Albert or McCabe family. And he never mentioned that he had a working relationship with Kevin Albert, that they went to the same gym and that they were friendly. They talk about the fact that interview notes indicate that Trooper Proctor knew Colin Albert had been at 34 Fairview, but it was never memorialized in his reports, just in his handwritten notes. The reports being the part that are turned over to the defense, of course. They talk about text messages where different troopers are going back and forth over the medical examiner's determination that the manner of death here was undetermined, not homicide, not accident, but undetermined. And it seemed in that series of texts that Trooper Proctor also refers to the ME as a whack job. And then we got into text with Trooper Proctor and Kevin Albert, where they had gone to work a case in July 2022 down the Cape, and on the way back, stopped to get dinner. They were in Trooper Proctor's cruiser, had some beers, and Kevin Albert left his badge in Trooper Proctor's car. And then there was some questioning because the text messages seemed to indicate that Kevin Albert wasn't sure where his gun was and whether or not he brought it with him. And so the questioning from Jackson was, did he also leave his gun in your car? And there was not really a clear answer from Trooper Proctor on that. But it was clear the badge was left in the car and they were trying to arrange how he would get Kevin Albert's badge back to him. And texts indicating that Kevin Albert was wicked hungover after their evening of having dinner and a few beers, which I suspect was more than a few beers given everything else we've seen in this case. We also learned that there apparently is not really an evidence log, or at least a printed out evidence log, that evidence from the state troopers prints out stickers onto the evidence bags, and that's the reporting, but we sure haven't seen it yet. And then Alan Jackson brought up a handwritten note from Trooper DeChico saying that as he is reviewing the ring video footage at 0041 or 1241, the note says, taillights from driveway, I think she returned home. And on cross-examination, asked Trooper Proctor, why wasn't this in any of your reports? And he said, there's no date on DeCheco's note, so we have no idea when that's from. And there's no ring video from Karen Reed returning back to John O'Keefe's home on January 29th. And the question now remains, was there at one time ring footage of her pulling back into the driveway and then into the garage? And then at the end of cross-examination, Alan Jackson went through all of the things that Trooper Proctor said about Karen Reed, and then a text message with his sister. And in that exchange, Trooper Proctor tells his sister, in reference to Karen Reed, hopefully she kills herself. And then when asked about it, he said, it's just a figure of speech. And that he at times got emotional about the case when asked by Jackson if he had developed a hatred for Karen Reed. Cross-examination ended with Alan Jackson looking at Trooper Proctor and saying, shame on you, sir, which drew a swift objection and a strong admonishment by the court that those kind of comments are inappropriate. I'm surprised at this point that the court has not started to threaten the lawyers to sanction them, because she has remarked to both sides about their comments being unhelpful, and we see that even more on Friday. Witness 58 was Trooper Brian Tully, who was the supervisor whose first involvement in this case was really directing the search at 34 Fairview with the CERT team after conversations with Trooper Proctor and others, and telling the CERT team that he knew that they were looking for at least a shoe and any evidence of a vehicle collision and pieces of taillight. On Thursday, June 13th, day 24 of trial, the examination of Trooper Brian Tully resumed, and his testimony involved a lot of video of the path of travel of a black SUV that seems to be the black Lexus SUV moving through Canton from the waterfall to 34 Fairview. That also seems consistent with the movement of the defendant's phone. But even though we got a plotted map of the path of travel for the defendant, we didn't get into much more cell phone information except for this, which I thought was one of the more interesting and needed parts of this trooper's testimony. I don't know how much it helps the Commonwealth, though, and that's going to be up for your interpretation and ultimately the jury's. But he reviewed the call logs from the defendant's phone and saw that between 12:33 a.m. and 6:03 a.m., there were 53 calls made by Karen Reed's phone to John O'Keefe's phone. That is a lot of calls. What does 53 calls in that span of time mean to you? Because we haven't gotten into the rest of it yet, but I'm sure there were also text messages during that time. And I wonder if there are voicemails from the defendant left on the victim's phone, and we just haven't gotten there yet. I'm sure there are at least some, because we've already heard one voicemail that was left on the defendant's phone from Karen Reed's phone, having an open line in Jen McCabe's car when they find John O'Keefe. So I imagine that there's more, and that's going to come into evidence next week. We also heard that there are calls reflected to Jen McCabe, Carrie Roberts, the Cameranos, and after John O'Keefe is founded, John O'Keefe's family. But I think it's interesting to note that Karen Reed was calling John O'Keefe's family members after he was found. Cross-examination started with, "But you didn't apply for a search warrant to search 34 Fairview, why not?" And Alan Jackson pointed out to the trooper, who said he didn't believe they had enough connection between John O'Keefe and 34 Fairview. He said, but he was an invited guest. He was expected to be there. There were other people at 34 Fairview that night. You found a broken glass like you could find inside a house. He was outside without a jacket. A jacket could be in the house. There's a missing shoe. He doesn't have gloves and a scarf, as if he could have just come out from inside. But it seemed to me in the answers that the trooper gave that it was determined that this was a motor vehicle collision, so they weren't going to apply for a search warrant to look in 34 Fairview because they had already decided. And then there was some questioning about a statement from the plow driver who reported seeing a vehicle outside of 34 Fairview. When asked why this trooper didn't go interview that person or why they didn't follow up with it more, the trooper said on redirect that he thought that the identification of it being a Ford Edge was highly suggestive, in that the defense investigator just pointed to a Ford Edge and was like, a car like that, that's the car. And the plow driver said yes, and that the story had changed a few times. So I'm going to be interested to hear that testimony when we get to it. But the trooper's like, this is why we didn't follow up. We didn't believe it was reliable information. The next witness, 59, was a sergeant who took buckle swab for DNA from Trooper Proctor and Trooper Buchnick. Then we got into all the DNA witnesses. Without going much further into the DNA witnesses, and there were a number of them, the taillight DNA had John O'Keefe's DNA on the taillight, but excluded Troopers Proctor and Buchnick. Again, I don't think this is surprising, considering that Karen Reed and John O'Keefe were in a relationship. Karen Reed parked her car at John O'Keefe's home. There's a lot of reasons his DNA could be on Karen Reed's car. I don't think it's determinative of anything based on the nature of their relationship and the fact that we know he was in the car that night. Same with testing from the hair. It was tested for mitochondrial DNA that was consistent with John O'Keefe's profile. We got into the state crime lab DNA testing. They tested the drinking glass that had multiple contributors, including John O'Keefe. They tested John O'Keefe's clothes. His DNA was on all of his clothing. And the other samples or contributors of DNA oftentimes were too small of a sample to test a profile for DNA. So when there were multiple contributors to any of the things on John O'Keefe's clothes, they were often too small to test. So no one else was identified, even though in parts there were other contributors. But that also indicates to me that there wasn't someone else's blood or saliva or anything like that on John O'Keefe's clothes where it was swabbed for DNA. Then on Friday, it was a wild day. Friday started quite late. And as I started court, you know what? I have a grace period. As I started court, the court had cut the cameras. So Friday, numerous jurors were interviewed at sidebar, and it seems that when the first juror was brought into the courtroom to be interviewed at sidebar, they were briefly caught on the pool cameras in the courtroom. It seems that the camera operator was not given the heads up that any jurors were coming in, because normally jurors come into the jury box and the cameras are set up in a way that they won't even pick them up. But the jurors were coming over to sidebar, and they had a wide shot of the courtroom opened up before court resumed. So a juror was caught on the pool cameras. Cameras were ordered off. Multiple jurors were interviewed at sidebar about something else. One juror was dismissed. The court said that they were dismissed for reasons personal to them, and it's not to be considered. There are now 15 jurors remaining, 6 men, 9 women, and we are now down 2 jurors, which going into week 8 is actually not bad. Witness 63 was not only difficult testimony in that it was thickly scientific digital evidence, but it was also streamed through the court's Zoom with the worst camera angle and recorded on a potato. So not only do we have potato recording, but it was very scientific evidence that was not easily broken down between the answers being fairly high level and scientific and very much a lot of jargon, and Lally's questioning. I liked the witness very much, but she did not break down the data to an easy level to consume it, especially for the jurors who can't pause, can't rewind, can't go back. They have to just try to figure out what it means. And we know there's going to be a battle of the experts as to this point. So Jessica Hyde was brought in to testify specifically about Jen McCabe's phone searching the house long to die in the cold, and then the other search that was spelled slightly differently. Her conclusions, and she gave a lot of in-depth information about the forensic tools she used to come to these conclusions, what she looked for, where the data was coming from, and her conclusions were that the 2:27 a.m. timestamp is not related to search. It is related to Safari tab activity. And so the reason it shows up on the Celebrite report the way it does is because the Celebrite report pulls from different databases and from different artifacts, and that time doesn't go to a search being done, it goes to tab movement. But there also were searches for Hockomock sports around that 2:27 a.m. time, and that the time that is tagged to the searches is 6:22 and 6:23. And that there was one search for How's Long to Die in the Cold and one search that was like TICKLD, the other search. She also gave an expert opinion on why the defense expert came to their opinion. And she said it was based on a misinterpretation of the artifact data because it goes to the tab activity and not a time of search. Why wasn't, Google subpoenaed or what have you to look through search records? I don't know. This is how the Commonwealth was putting that information in. We are going to see a defense expert on this. Yannetti very narrowly crossed this expert who said, really, they couldn't rule out search time data because you can't rule out what doesn't exist. And the 2:27 a.m. timestamp doesn't come from a file that relates to when a search is done. It comes from a tab. So she's like, I can't tell you if that excludes or includes a search being done at that time. That time and that information isn't about search. And that's all I was asked to look at. And that's what I looked at. It'll be interesting to see how the defense expert breaks this down and whose testimony is easier for the jury to understand. At the end of the day, the fight over Jen McCabe's search is really a fight with the prosecution trying to disprove what the defense is telling the jurors so they can stand up and say the defense is trying to make you look a million different directions, but forward. And the evidence here, they are going to argue in closing, points to only one person and has always pointed to one person, Karen Reed. And based on her own statements, this is why, you need to come back with a guilty verdict or whatever they argue in closing. It probably won't be that concise 8 weeks in. I feel pretty confident in that. So the cross on that was very limited. And then we got into witness 64, Trooper Paul, who works for CARS, the collision accident reconstruction. I am deeply frustrated with this witness. I was hoping for clear and concise data from Karen Reed's vehicle. And midway through this accident reconstructionist testimony, he starts talking about the Toyota tech system, and that after having Karen Reed's car for a year, he started trying to figure out what other kind of data could be downloaded from it, and then familiarized himself in 2023 with the Toyota tech system, but wasn't familiar with it before. Originally, he had only downloaded data from the airbag reports. We know an airbag didn't deploy here. He did mechanical testing and inspection. The vehicle was operating properly. He did a visibility inspection, but said they didn't really give it a lot of credence because they had determined that this was an intentional collision, not an accidental collision. So all of the data that he is relying on is based on the Toyota Tech System or Tech Stream download that he didn't really understand was available until a year after this happened. And then he is trying to interpret that data and says that that data indicated to him, and his expert opinion was that John O'Keefe was hit in a forward projection with a side swipe, that his arm was injured by the taillight, and he was pushed to the left and spun, and that is how the back of his head ended up colliding with something, the curb, the ground, what have you. He based that on what he says the data says, and we have not gotten to cross yet, so I imagine this is going to get wild on Monday. But he says the data indicates a sudden decrease in speed from 24.2 miles per hour to 23.6 miles an hour while the pedal is still depressed, and a shift in steering angle that is somewhat significant while the car is mostly going backwards over 97.35 feet total. But the data is all done by key cycle. So when the car is turned on and turned off, so it does not have a date or time on the data, which is very interesting and also very frustrating because it's not clear that this data necessarily lines up with January 29th, but we are still in direct and I am waiting for it to become more clear, though I am losing optimism that it will. And as the jury was dismissed from the day, the court made clear that this coming week, there is a full court day on Monday. You're going to just want the Lawnerd app so I can alert you when we get to cross-examination and stuff. Full court day Monday, full day of voir dire, no jury Tuesday, court holiday and federal holiday for Juneteenth on Wednesday. Thursday is a full court day. Friday is a half court day. I'm going to be traveling overnight in there somewhere, so Friday will be a travel court stream for me with the constantly improving travel setup because these things always happen while the Dave Matthews Band is on tour, but I digress. At the very end of the day on Friday, they voir dired the accident reconstructionist about the Ring video showing or purporting to show Karen Reed's SUV backing into John O'Keefe's SUV. It seems that the prosecution asked this expert to render an opinion about whether that contact could have broken the taillight of Karen Reed's SUV, and that expert opinion was not disclosed to the defense. The defense is asking that this witness not be allowed to render that opinion for the discovery violation, but it also seems that this witness doesn't really know how much force is needed to break a taillight like that they didn't do any measurements between John O'Keefe's car and Karen Reed's car to really determine that that type of collision couldn't cause the taillight to be broken, or what parts of John O'Keefe's car might line up with Karen Reed's car to cause that type of collision, because the reconstructionist was saying, well, John O'Keefe's bumper would have needed to be more compressed before the taillight would even hit John O'Keefe's car based off of photos. So I don't know if the court's going to let that opinion in, but the defense was pissed that it wasn't disclosed. And the expert's opinion doesn't seem solid at this point, but we're not done with direct. And we will see what cross-examination with Alan Jackson brings on Monday. These, I know, are longer, quick bits, but thank you for being here. Thank you for being a Lawnerd, and thank you to our sponsor. Thank you to today's sponsor, Green Chef. If you've been wanting to try a meal kit, now is the time. Summer always gets busy, especially if you're spending your days watching Trial with me, and Green Chef delivers fresh ingredients directly to your door with over 80 weekly menu items to choose from that will fit any lifestyle, from keto and paleo to protein plus to vegan and vegetarian, gluten-free, or just more balanced meals. Green Chef comes with easy to read instructions and everything you need to make delicious meals easily. So if you are ready to find out for yourself why Green Chef is the #1 meal kit for eating well, go to greenchef.com/EmilyBaker50 and use code EmilyBaker50 to get 50% off plus 20% off your next 2 months. That's greenchef.com/EmilyBaker50 to get 50% off plus 20% off your next 2 months. Thank you, Green Chef, for being a sponsor on this episode and for making sure I have dinner while I'm in trial, because that's what we've been eating this summer. For deep dives into the stories that I covered here, you can find them on my YouTube channel at The Emily D. Baker and The Emily Show podcast. I stream every Tuesday and Thursday. The podcast goes live on Wednesdays. And if you want to stay in the loop with everything I'm doing, receive the fastest notifications out there, and get more Law Nerd community, join me at lawnerdapp.com, our free app for iOS and Android.